Okay, so hello and welcome to another Friends from the Field webinar. My name is Brooke McDonald, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Blue Hill Heritage Trust. I am joined by my co-host, Tori Robbins, who is an educator with the Island Heritage Trust. And these Friends from the Field webinars are brought to you by both organizations, so thank you for your support. Today's talk is titled Communities and Climate, What We Can Learn from Mainers About Acting in the Face of Change, and it will be presented by Dr. Lydia Horne. But before I share some more details about her and the talk today, I'm going to hand it over to Tori to talk to you a little bit about how to use Zoom and what to expect with our question period.
Good afternoon. I'm Tori here at Island Heritage Trust. And if you're a little unfamiliar with Zoom, if you hover at the bottom of your screen, you will probably see a bunch of icons, one of them being a chat button. And then down a little further, you'll see a Q&A symbol. So if you have a question for Lydia or comment that you want to discuss, you can drop your questions, comments in either of those sections. Brooke and I will, at the end of our workshop, we will go over those questions and we'll kind of bounce back and forth and we'll ask those for you to Lydia and get to hear her response.
All right, thank you, Tori. So
Welcome.
yes, our speaker today is Dr. Lydia Horne. She grew up in Holden, Maine, and is currently an environmental social science scientist at the University of Maine in Orono in the School of Forest Resources. Her work examines underlying factors that influence behaviors and how communities can enhance their resilience to climate change in natural resource management contexts. So during the webinar today, she'll talk to you about Western Maine, Downeast Maine, and Mount Desert Island to learn about how these tourism-dependent communities are adapting to their most pressing climate change concerns. So Lydia, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me here. I'm going to share my slides. And is everyone able to see those in their full screen? Okay, great. I'm going to try to stay on time because I'm a little bit of a talker. I just wanted to mention that my connection to the Blue Hill area is that my mother, Martha Horne, was a longtime teacher at George Stevens Academy. So perhaps you or a child in your family took math with her at some point, or health or biology. She retired a couple of years ago. So I am familiar with the Blue Hill area through that connection. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I do, and I want to focus specifically on the work I've done around climate change. As Brooke mentioned, I'm an environmental social scientist, so even though I'm in the School of Forest Resources, I always have to clarify and say, I don't study trees, I study people and how they interact with trees and other natural resources. So the underlying idea of social science is quite simply that our perceptions, the knowledge we have about things, the experiences we're having or have had in our past, the norms that we experience with our peers shape how we behave. And so an example of this is how you may set an intention to go to the gym soon because there's a lot of folks setting intentions to get in shape around the new year. Now, taking that example, we also know that perceptions do not always relate to or result in behavioral change. Thinking about the gym, if you've ever set the intention to go to the gym and didn't quite make it there, you know what I'm talking about. Maybe you were just too tired after work. Maybe the weather was bad. Maybe you just didn't feel like it. So, environmental social scientists, we think about perceptions, we think about behavior, but we also know that it's not like a one-to-one predictive ratio there. So the kinds of work that I do focus on climate change. And I look at how people think about climate change, how they experience climate change, how those perceptions of climate change might influence behavioral responses, like decisions to adapt to certain impacts or decisions to mitigate because you're concerned about climate change, for example. And then I look at how to scale up perceptions and behavior beyond the individual. So I look at a community as often my unit of analysis. So I'm interested in answering questions like what kinds of community characteristics foster resilience to different changes like climate change? And then how can communities enhance their overall resilience using the things that they're really good at, their strengths, and addressing the things that they may lack or the weaknesses? And then I use a lot of different methods to do this. You'll see me talking mostly about interviews today and a little bit about participatory workshops. But I also do survey work. You can see in the photo, I guess it's the bottom right. Full disclosure, that's me pretending to be a visitor to Acadia National Park. And one of my research assistants at the time, he is modeling what it is to do an intercept survey. So we ask people on like the trail or on their way to the visitor center if they'll answer a few questions for us. And that's just one way that we gather data. I've also done some kind of weirder things like asked students to draw so I can understand what kind of connections they're making mentally. And I've also done something called a pile sort, which is the bottom left picture, where I give people a bunch of different terms and I ask them, how would you sort these into similar or different piles? And that's also a way to reveal our underlying mental schema in a way that's like a little bit more visual, because it is hard to capture how people think about things. Okay. And the last sort of disclaimer before I really jump into it is that I am always working as part of a team. I've had wonderful collaborators on the projects I'm going to discuss today and on new projects. So just know that while I'm here today, it is representing the work of a huge group of people. Okay, so we're going to start with a few slides introducing the idea of tourism as a community issue and as a climate change issue here in Maine. And then, as Brooke mentioned, we're going to go on a little tour, starting in Western Maine, moving to Downeast Maine, and then settling on MDI. So I wanted to share a little bit about how I came to working with climate change topics. So I love to travel. Probably a lot of folks on this call also love to travel. I didn't know what climate change was until I went to college. So it seems like it's really more frequently taught in K through 12, but I had never heard of it until my freshman year of college. And then I realized that there was like this big problem that we weren't talking about. So I was immediately interested in that. But then it also made me think about the context of tourism, which can be very harmful to the environment, but also is really beneficial, especially for economies like here in Maine. And then there's like a suite of positive and negative impacts to sociocultural factors within a destination. And so here in the state of Maine, these numbers are a little bit outdated, but tourism brings in billions of dollars. It's a huge economic sector for the state. There's like over 37 million visitors compared to the 1.3 million people who visit here. So it's like a massive influx of people coming to the state. Now, 2020 was kind of a weird anomaly with the pandemic. So there was a dip, but overall, we're seeing globally that tourism numbers are bouncing back and even growing after the pandemic. So this is just to say that tourism is here to stay, but climate change is also increasingly urgent. And so I like to describe my work focused on tourism dependent communities as important because Maine is so reliant on tourism. Therefore, tourism is sort of at the heart of a lot of community decision making. And then you fold in that climate change impact, those climate change impacts that we're experiencing to have another layer. So I want people to take a second to think about a tourism destination. Maybe it's one that you've been to recently or one that you're going to over this winter. Perhaps it's warmer than it is here in Maine. Typically, what people think about when they think about a destination is an attraction. So why are you going to that place in the first instance? Here in Maine, it's a lot of experiencing natural resources or cultural resources, but there's other motivations for travel, experiencing good food, for example, meeting up with friends and family, learning a language, etc. But one of the things that people sort of forget about when they think about tourism destinations is that communities, the residents of the area, are really the backbone of that tourism experience, right? They're like maintaining the resources, they're working in the tourism industry, oftentimes either directly through things like being a guide or indirectly through like working at a hospital, which hopefully you don't need when you're a tourist, but those kinds of support services are not just for tourists or communities, they're for both. And so I like to think of tourism destinations as overlapping with this idea of community resilience in terms of like similar scale. And I think that we can conceptually draw lessons learned from the community resilience work and apply them to tourism destinations. And so a lot of my work is thinking about how communities can balance climate change adaptation while building resilience to climate change and continuing to offer a high quality, engaging tourism experience. Easy, right? So we are going to go over to Western Maine. Folks might be familiar with the Maine tourism regions. There's 8 of them. Now I'm worried that I miscounted. There's 8 of them, I believe. And in Western Maine, the tourism region is called the Maine Lakes and Mountains region, which makes sense. There are a lot of lakes and a lot of mountains there. So this was one of the first projects I worked on when I was a graduate student at the University of Maine, and I was specifically looking at perceptions of risk related to climate change as they might impact tourism in Western Maine. And one thing that's really interesting about Western Maine is that it's so reliant on winter tourism. So of course, things like decreases in snowfall, warmer winters, those are all having big impacts on snow-related recreation up there. And so my study purpose was to better understand how these groups of tourism suppliers, which I like defined as like business owners, nonprofits, town managers, for example, any folks who are working to somehow offer a tourism product to both visitors but also community members, how were they perceiving their risk to climate change? And how, if at all, were those perceptions influencing behavioral responses? And in this case, I was really interested in adaptation behaviors. So I primarily used interviews with these folks. I like to say about social science that it's a lot of talking to people, either directly through like an interview or a focus group, or indirectly, like a survey link that you might get and complete in your home. And so I'm not gonna bore you with the details of extensive data analysis and whatnot, but I want to share like one result from each of the different areas, each of the different geographic areas. And one of the results from this study was that risk perceptions to climate change were really high. Folks were worried about it, they were talking about it, but there was a lot of uncertainty. And that was related to uncertainty in when climate change impacts were going to be experienced. Were they already experiencing impacts, or was it just regular weather variation? And that uncertainty made it really hard to do things like plan long term for your business. And that was compounded by the lack of financial resources that folks felt they did not have at their immediate disposal. And so, an example of a quote from a participant who's been given a pseudonym to illustrate the idea of the local to global, and are we experiencing this global phenomenon here in this local area, local part of Maine? The quote is, "We hear about the big picture, global climate change, but this person didn't think that everyday folks in Western Maine were really thinking about how a global phenomenon might be impacting their local area." And so one of the practical implications of this finding is that we as scientists, do a lot of like modeling and all of that, but we need to be better at translating the science into a scale that makes sense for local decision makers. So it's great that everyone knows about climate change, although not everyone believes that it's happening. But what does that mean for Western Maine, Northern Maine, Downeast Maine, Southern Maine? So we as scientists need to communicate more locally relevant information that can then inform on-the-ground decision making. We are going to move from Western Maine down east. So getting a little bit closer to Blue Hill here, but still kind of far away. We're going to look at the Bay of Machias. And this is work that I did when I actually did both my master's and my PhD at the University of Maine. So Western Maine was my focus for my master's, and the Bay of Machias was one of the focal areas for my PhD. And so folks have probably been to Western Maine. You've probably been to the Bay of Machias. I should have moved the box here, but you'll know that the dike is very low lying. It connects both sides of downtown Machias, and it is oftentimes impassable after a storm, where there's been like high storm surge, especially combined with a high tide, because the road is strewn with debris, so seaweed and rocks. So this is also compounded by things like rising sea level. So all of these intersecting climate change impacts are really impacting the infrastructure here. As just one example of what's going on in the Bay of Machias. So this study was focused on understanding what's happening in the Bay of Machias. How are folks responding to climate change? What are the barriers they're experiencing that are preventing them from responding to climate change? And one of the things that I like about this idea of community resilience is if folks are from a rural area, you may have heard a lot of really negative characteristics or descriptions of your place, like, oh, it's very poor, there's no jobs, there's no people, there's nothing to do, right? I like grew up hearing people saying that kind of thing about where I lived, and it wasn't even that rural, I feel like by Maine standards. So I like the idea of community resilience because it can be this sort of evaluation can be approached from, instead of a deficit model, an asset model. So it's asking about, okay, like, yeah, maybe there's not as much economic diversity in rural communities as there are in more urban communities, but there's all kinds of other really positive capacities that that community has. So a good example is you probably know your neighbors, for better or worse, in a small town. So there's a higher level of social connection and maybe more, or maybe stronger social networks in a rural town than there is in like a big city where you might not know who is your neighbor or who you're walking by on the street. And so that's one reason why I like to look at this from a community resilience perspective, because it lets me better understand each community in its own context rather than trying to say, this is what it looks like to be resilient. Instead, I can say, here are the ways that these different communities are resilient in different ways. And so the study purpose was to delve into adaptation behaviors, but also to understand what community characteristics were enabling responses in the face of climate change. Again, this is mostly interviews, although we did do a pilot survey. We actually went to, among other things, we went to the Blueberry Festival, which was both very fun for us and also helped us get a lot of responses with folks traveling to the area. And this is actually pictures of us on the beach, and we camped overnight for the Blueberry Festival, so we didn't have to drive so far. And these are three amazing undergraduate research assistants who helped with this work and have since moved on to like bigger and better things since graduating. So what we ended up doing with these interviews, again, happy to talk about the process, but don't want to bore you with the details. We ended up interviewing about 20 or so folks, and we asked them questions about like what is great about their community, what's challenging about their community, etc. What are they seeing for behavioral responses to climate change? And then we collated all of this data and sort of came up with this ranking of the characteristics from a few slides ago that are typically present in a resilient community. And you can see that there's a lot of strengths in the Bay of Machias. So this sort of deficit model of rural communities was not what we found here. Wasn't very surprising to me being from a rural area, but probably isn't surprising to you. So we saw things like engaged governance. So local people felt that they could communicate with local decision makers and that their voices made an opinion their their voices were listened to and influenced action. Another example is positive outlook. So people were really optimistic. We heard a lot of sort of the can-do attitude. Yeah, climate change is scary, but we're gonna address it head on, and we can do this. So those are examples of strengths. Probably not a surprise. There were fewer economic options, so fewer job options in the area. And this is kind of a pervasive problem across Maine, crumbling infrastructure, right? So our roads are in need of some updating and maintenance, and it's really hard to get future thinking innovations for infrastructure when maintaining them is already a challenge. What I wanted to highlight is what I meant by mixed, and I thought I'd pull the example from people, place, relationships. So this is exactly what it sounds like. It's like the emotional bonds that we have in connection to a place. So think about like, okay, this is a place that I really love to be. I feel very comfortable. It's beautiful. I feel at peace when I'm in this location. And typically, if there's stronger people-place connections, that is a positive trait that enhances resilience. And so this is where we had like both positive and negative themes emerging from the interviews. So participants talked about how there's such a strong connection to natural resource livelihoods in Down East, fishing, blueberry barrens, etc. And so that really, in their opinions, created this shared environmental ethos. So people cared about the environment overall, folks felt. But then they describe this challenge of retaining youth to the area. So I'm sort of hearkening back to my childhood where people were like, there's nothing to do here. I can't wait to leave. Right. So that kind of mentality was not enhancing resilience. And so that's how we ended up with this mixed ranking for people place relationships. And this is important because if you have, the research has shown, if you have strong people place relationships or connection to place, that can really motivate folks to act in a way that protects that place. So it can spur climate change action. And this is an illustrative quote that I love that sort of summarized that commitment to place in a rural area here in Maine. So this is again a pseudonym, but a quote from a participant who is talking about the richness and people and values that she sees living in Down East that seems to be lacking in other places. She acknowledges that they're not the richest financially, but they can be the richest when it comes to human values. And that was more important to her than having financial resources. And I think that really embodies sort of the sentiment of living, many folks share living in a rural community. Okay, so kind of the practical implications, this is probably not groundbreaking for folks, but we're suggesting there's no one size fits all for what a resilient community could look like as they face climate change. But definitely communities should consider what they're already strong in and what they already have for available resources and how they could use those to address some of their top concerns. And even maybe perhaps address a weakness that they feel like they have. And Machias, the Bay of Machias was a really great example because they had really strong partnerships, so connections to other people, and were regularly working together. There was a lot of deep local knowledge about what was happening in the community and what climate change impacts were being observed. And there's a lot of expertise in grant writing. So they leveraged those skills to apply for a grant to explore seawall design options, which they did not have that expertise, but they brought somebody in once that funding was acquired to address a weakness, so poor infrastructure. Apologies, I think I inhaled some dust. Okay, we're gonna get closer, closer to Blue Hill and go to MDI. Okay, sorry folks, I'm recovering. Okay, so in this particular study, I want to talk about a later stage. in the process. So we were once again looking at how people perceived climate change and how that was influencing behavioral response. But we were more interested in sort of that applied. How do we build the capacity of groups of people who are interested in working in these areas based on the information that we already collected from interviews and surveys? And so overall, we wanted to increase sort of collaboration across different groups and build destination resilience. So what I want to focus on is really this phase 3, but you should know that information came out of interviews with tourism suppliers. So again, business owners, people who worked at the National Park Service, people who worked for nonprofits who were interacting with a tourism experience, and town managers and sort of like town infrastructure. We also surveyed visitors coming to Mount Desert Island. So folks coming to Bar Harbor, coming to Acadia National Park and other places on the island to see, were they planning on coming even if climate change impacts got worse? The answer is yes. And then we use this information to work with community partners to co-create a series of, at the time, it was the peak of the pandemic, a series of Zoom workshops. Okay. And if you're curious about the methods a little bit more, just know that it took forever to analyze the data, but I want to talk about the workshop because it's a little bit different from the other 2 locations we've discussed today. Okay, so the question here is, how can we use the findings from the previous phases to increase climate change planning capacity in a way that's not just, hey, I'm a researcher at the University of Maine, here's what you should do. Because that's really not the way that I like to do science. I'm much more collaborative and participatory. So I like to share my knowledge, but I don't think I'm the expert really in a lot of things. But how could the knowledge be useful for folks on the ground is sort of where I'm coming from with my sort of positionality. Okay, so this was peak pandemic. So the action shot I have of the team working is a Zoom screenshot. Hopefully not too triggering for folks to go back to the pandemic. But the 5 of us, we were at the time an all-student team. We ended up working with 4 lovely and very supportive community partners. And between the 2 groups, we designed a series of 2 half-day workshops to increase awareness of climate change, but also think about, okay, but what could we actually do? So kind of the actions, and sort of prioritizing what could be done easily, what could be done quickly, what is maybe the most important thing to be done. So various criteria. And this is a detail of sort of the goal of the workshops and then who was there. We had about a dozen folks who participated. And this was the first time that some folks were in the virtual room together. It was a little bit surprising given all of the amazing climate change work and adaptation work that's happening on MDI. It was interesting that tourism hadn't really been considered as much as related to climate change. So it was very much like, okay, how can we shore up local infrastructure and benefit residents, but like tourists and tourism businesses hadn't really been integrated as much into that conversation. And so that was a cool outcome of the workshop to have folks representing different viewpoints in the room together. In the first day, we worked on identifying and prioritizing climate change impacts. And I also have to say opportunities, right? So there might be some opportunities that if folks are positioned to be nimble and to respond to, that could potentially be a benefit, at least in the short term. And then from what we brainstormed on day 1, we then took day 2 to think about how we could create actionable solutions around those particular planning priorities. And so what I mean by that is we asked folks who were like super knowledgeable about the local area and knew what was happening on the ground. We asked folks to give us a list of climate change impacts that were happening on MDI or potentially opportunities that might be happening in the near future. And then we asked, once we had this full list, we had a voting exercise where we asked folks what the most like significant or impactful in terms of magnitude climate change impacts were, and then what they thought was the easiest thing to address. So like what would be the easy win? What would be maybe the most important thing to focus on? And this was just the top 5 for each category. I know it's a lot of words to absorb, but one thing I want to point out is that increasing visitation and the opportunity to model sustainability were in the top 3 for both of these categories. And so what we ended up doing in day 2 was focused on how could we adequately address or take advantage or operationalize these goals. And because of time, it was only I think it was like 3 hours 2 days. So we only had a couple of hours to tackle this. For time, we focused on the top for each category. So we had folks thinking about what increased visitation, which is projected to continue to happen on MDI, what could that look like? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? How does that intersect with climate change? But then we also had this suggestion that it would be potentially, quote, easy, I mean, relatively speaking, to dovetail with a lot of local community efforts, especially around solar energy, to increase the sustainability of MDI and extend that to the tourism sector. So, for example, how can we get visitors to embody sustainability while they're on vacation? And just to add a little bit of nuance here to better understand like the focus, when folks were talking about changing visitation patterns, there was a lot of nuance. So yes, increasing visitation, so more people coming to MDI was a focal area, but we acknowledged that there's also the changing in when people were coming to visit the area. So a lot more folks coming during the shoulder seasons, so fall and spring, and even in the winter as well. And how can we the royal we, how can the community ensure like a safe, positive tourism experience when there's maybe not as much capacity to do so in the shoulder seasons? And then they also acknowledged that there's changing visitor behaviors. So people were going to different places to avoid like overcrowding, for example. And so then some of those areas were getting quite crowded, right? So the human behavior piece was also discussed, not just the quantity of visitors, but what are people doing while they're there? And then the becoming a model of sustainability topic. This is really interesting because when we co-developed the workshops, we felt that a focus on adaptation would be the most productive. But because it was participatory, we let whatever topics emerge, and the workshop participants said that they wanted to talk about this opportunity related to sustainability. So in that way, we had to actually sort of pivot a little bit in between workshop 1 and 2 to better address this topic. And so the goal of modeling sustainability was, of course, to benefit residents from things like renewable energy, perhaps more walkable or bikeable or public transit options, etc. But then those would also benefit visitors as well. And I really like this quote from one of the attendees who talked about establishing Mount Desert Island as like a hub of green tourism and a model of a community that is really like walking the walk when it comes to sustainability practices, and how that could be actually like a green marketing opportunity to say this is a trend here on MDI. And the research has shown that more tourists are becoming eco-conscious. And so this like sustainable tourism movement is growing. So, but good for community, good for tourism. Okay, how are we doing on time? Okay, great. We're doing okay. So we focused on this challenge and opportunities related to changing visitation and to modeling sustainability on day 2. And part of what we did was identify the top priorities and suggest maybe some action items related to those different priorities. And so I've included a couple here. The first being creating a cohesive educational message that promotes sustainable behaviors and safety. And that was really stemming from conversations about how places that maybe advertise the destination are promoting the experience of seeing the sunrise or the sunset from the top of Cadillac, which is an amazing experience, but it is an overcapacity experience. There's trampling on top of Cadillac, there's challenges moving vehicles, right? The permit system, the reservation system is in response to these challenges. And so folks on MDI were saying, we'd love people to have a similar experience, but in a different location. So can we create an educational message that spreads people out, for example, or encourages them to bike to the park, right? Or educates them about safe behaviors for hiking in winter. The second priority was increasing the sustainable transportation infrastructure. So folks love the Island Explorer, but acknowledge that it was at or maybe perhaps above capacity. So there were discussions around like making more bike lanes or promoting biking between different areas, or could there be a pedestrian only part of downtown Bar Harbor, etc. Or can we increase sort of education for visitors around how to actually use the bus? And maybe some community members as well. This was ended up being a really like a low-hanging fruit. I would say the lowest hanging fruit. Folks at the workshops were talking about how there's so much different data collection and research happening about climate change in the area, but nobody's sharing it in the same way. So we just came up with a simple idea of, can we just have a Google folder that folks dump like their data and their reports into, so other organizations can look at that and say, oh, it's really interesting what that land trust organization found. Here's how it could connect to mine. And then the last thing I'll talk about today is the idea of increasing the capacity of the hospitality sector to handle increased visitation. And so the background on this is folks felt that, and rightly so, every time a visitor intersects with somebody working in the tourism and hospitality sector, there's an opportunity to communicate information. Whether it's, hey, have you been on this trail? Have you eaten at this restaurant, right? Have you gone further down east to visit the Bay of Machias? And so the participants at the workshop suggested, could there be a little bit more training so that that communication could be more targeted? Oh, there's a lot of cars on top of Cadillac. Here's another place that you could go to experience a beautiful sunrise that's also safe. So that was one of the opportunities that folks identified. And so the key takeaways for me from this experience, facilitating the workshops and co-creating the design of the workshops to make sure they were like locally relevant, was that collaboration is going to be key. And a lot of the action priorities that folks identified talked about like this cohesion, coordination across different scales. So it wasn't just creating a message, it was sort of linking state level to local level needs. We also talked about this idea that Maine is a pretty great place to visit in the summer. It's not too hot, especially relative to the southern part of the US. But we did talk about, are there going to be days when it is too hot and visitation may experience a decline during these high heat days, especially if we're not maybe adapting to that, right? So are there enough cool places for folks to go so they don't overheat? And that extends not just to tourists, that extends to residents, right? How are we weathering these hotter summers that we're experiencing? And then being like really positive in the face of climate change, there's this opportunity to model sustainability. So not only is that reducing the contributions to climate change, which is a win, but it's also creating this opportunity for a more sustainable tourism model, which could be beneficial in terms of advertising, but also in terms of visitor education. I mean, how many folks have been on a vacation, learned something, and then brought it back with them, or like made a behavioral change in relation to something that they've learned? So there's like that educational piece that extends way beyond folks coming just to MDI and like going home to wherever they live in the world. And then also, we had suggestions about how to bridge some of the research that's happening and make it more relevant for what decisions are actually happening on the ground, and better sharing those resources. And I'll just reiterate this again. I really appreciated the different perspectives that were in in the participatory planning workshops. Some folks had worked together before for a long time, and then some folks were just meeting for the first time. So we certainly couldn't have co-created the solutions ideas without different perspectives being at the table. And I think that was a strength of the workshop series overall. Okay, so like kind of trying to bring it all together. What can we learn from these studies? This is sort of how I think about the collection of work that I do and try to make meaning or like a cohesive narrative around it. So we know, living in Maine, that climate change is affecting the states in different ways. So we saw like winter destinations in Western Maine really being hard hit by changes in snowfall, in winter temperatures. Of course, this has an impact on ticks, water temperature, etc. But then when we went to the Bay of Machias, the focus was really on like flooding, sea level rise, and storm surge and how that's impacting local infrastructure. So we know that different places are experiencing different aspects of climate change. And so the question is like, what can communities learn from each other, even though they're so different and there's not a one size fits all solution to encouraging adaptation or mitigation? In my work, I found that communities are concerned about climate change. Maybe some folks aren't calling it climate change, but they are noticing changes. But they don't always know how to respond. And I would like throw myself in there as well. Or if we do know how to respond, there are still barriers to actually realizing those changes. And so I think it's important that not only do we collaborate across different groups of people, like having different folks in a workshop, I think it's important for communities to collaborate with each other, share what they're doing. I think it's important for like my role as a researcher to connect the work that I'm doing broadly across Maine, but also to help facilitate connections with, hey, have you heard what this community over here is doing? It might be relevant to your case. And as a social scientist, I have to put a plug out here that sometimes when we talk about climate change, we forget to talk about how social systems are going to be impacted. And so I see a lot of work that is focusing on how important tourism is. And of course, that is a very important industry, but it almost feels like communities are sort of forgotten, even though they're the backbone of the tourism destination. So I want to bring the community piece back into tourism work. And then lastly, I would just wanted to restate different communities have different needs, and that means there's going to be different solutions. I think an overall takeaway is to think about strengths that each area has and to use those rather than coming from a deficit model about all the things that we lack. And that's really it for me today. I wanted to acknowledge like a huge list of collaborators and funding sources across this work. And of course, anyone who participated in an interview, in a survey, in a workshop. Certainly, I know folks are busy, so always appreciate that. And I've linked my email here as well, which I think also probably Tori and Brooke will share after the fact. But I am going to stop sharing my screen and open it up to questions while folks sort of gather themselves or transition from the talk to the Q&A. I have a little plug. If you get a random survey from somebody at a university or get asked for an interview, it could enhance your karma by completing that, even if you're not really sure what you're getting into it for. But we always appreciate when folks sort of participate, especially it can be kind of like a shot in the dark when you're sending out a mailed survey or an email survey to somebody you've never met. But we always appreciate folks who take the time to share their thoughts. And we're reaching out to you because you have a lot of expertise.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Yes, those survey data do get used, so please complete them. Thank you for sharing that talk also, because it's nice to talk about climate change in a way that's not so gloomy. It seems like there's some positivity around some of the research you've done and talking about action steps and resiliency. I think it's really important to talk about that, not just the gloom and doom all the time. So that's great. I see that there is a question in the Q&A already, and I'm going to read it to you in just a second. And I'm just going to remind everyone, like Tori said, you can put questions in the Q&A or in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on both of those locations. So This actually is more of a comment. Congratulations on all of your work in this important area. Again, I second that. So thank you so much. Oh, hi,
Thank you.
Randy.
That's like a great comment. Usually when it's a comment, not a question, it's usually somebody in academia rambling on and somehow pivoting the conversation to their pet project rather than the topic. So appreciate the supportive comment there.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, again, it's great. And you're focusing on so many different parts of the state. And again, we're not all the same. So that's awesome too. While other people are thinking about it, I would you mind, Lydia, sharing a little bit about how I know the three studies were very different, but how you selected your participants, especially I was thinking about the Western Maine, like how did you know who to talk to? And can you talk about that a little bit?
That's a great question. So Western Maine, I mean, they sort of followed a similar format, but in Western Maine, my supervisor, who Brooke, Sandra De Arias de Stone, she's at the university still. Folks may have encountered her before. She put me into contact with one person that she knew from Western Maine who was working in a nonprofit, and they had connected in like a forest resources capacity. And from there, I like met with that person, and we do something called snowball sampling a lot when we're asking folks who maybe participated in an interview, and we then ask, okay, at the end of the interview, is there anyone else you think we should talk to? Sometimes we ask specifically, is there anyone else you think we should talk to who would have a different perspective? Because you're sort of you're not going for numbers, you're going for diversity of perspectives. So in meeting that one person, that one connection, he suggested some other folks, and then eventually I was able to connect with those folks. They did an interview, and then they suggested more folks. And so that one person, sometimes we call them like a gatekeeper. So like a gatekeeper who sort of grants you entrance into a group or a community of people. And actually, it was really similar for the Bay of Machias, where I'd met somebody at, I think it was like a conference event, and we just connected. I knew she was working in the area, and the same thing when I was sort of transitioning there. Reached out to her, she referred some folks, and then they referred some more folks. In the case of Mount Desert Island, that was engineered through a specific program that was connecting graduate students with community partners. So there was like internships with this particular program, and mentorships and folks coming into the classroom to give sort of career talks. And so I had already met some of those folks, and I reached out to them through that university program connection when we were kicking off the work there. And of course, some folks I'd also met, you need permission to do things like surveys. So even just standing at the town office, like on a town square at a community event requires permission. So sometimes that was also a mechanism like, hey, can we do a survey on Maine Blueberry Fest Day? How do I contact that person? And then it can lead to further connections within a community. Because I've never lived in either of the three areas that I've talked about. I'm really focused here in Penobscot County. So, but had definitely been to all of those places before. So I think that helped a little bit in gaining rapport as being somebody who was from Maine and had traveled across Maine, even if I wasn't local to those three areas.
Awesome, thank you.
Great question. Thank you.
It looks like Randall has another comment, question here for us. He says the Blue Hill Peninsula has a good fortune to have benefited from the Community Resilience Partnership, CRP, funding from the state. Do you have any data yet about the CRP experiences here in coastal Maine?
That is a great question, Randall. And you're the second person this week to ask me about the CRP, which I am unfamiliar with. So the short answer is no, I don't have any information for you about that project. But I think it's really cool that it exists and that Maine, I mean, I think people who are not from Maine sort of think, oh, it's very rural, it's kind of sleepy. But as somebody who's maybe more positive outlook, I see the ways that Maine is leading in a lot of our like policy efforts. I'm not saying that we're perfect, But I think there's a lot of forward thinking with things like the CRP and a lot of other work happening. So sorry I couldn't provide more detailed response for you, Randall.
Yeah, he also added, we'd love to have someone evaluate us. So maybe
Ooh.
another grad student project can be for the Blue Hill Peninsula, Deer Isle area. That would be great.
Yeah, I'm super in the weeds with program evaluation right now, which doesn't have to be a specific program, right? But evaluating different things and certainly have some connections to folks working in the natural sciences area who can do maybe some of that biophysical work about how are the trees doing or what's happening with temperature that I don't have any expertise in.
Study people, right? You said?
Yeah. Yes.
All right. So no more questions that I see right now. So I really want to thank you, Lydia, Dr. Horne. I can't get myself to call you Dr. Horne yet.
It's
Sorry, but
weird. It's Lydia, folks.
so thank you for sharing your research with us. And thank you so much, Tori, for co-hosting with me today. And before we log off, I just want to share that our next Friends from the Field will be on January 15th. And it's titled The Wonderful World of Insects in Downeast, Maine, and will be presented by a local naturalist named Todd Miller. So look for that if you haven't seen it on our social medias. And again, thank all of you for joining us today and for supporting these programs. Friends from the Field and other programs like it are made possible because of donors like you. So if you've donated to Blue Hill Heritage Trust and or Island Heritage Trust in the past, we thank you so much for supporting us. And if you want to support us, please, both of our websites are make it very easy to provide a donation. So please visit either one, both. That would be awesome. And thank you so much for your support. All right, I am going to say goodbye for now, and I will see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you both for having me.